In the previous lesson, Preparing to Shift, you learned about how a heavy truck transmission works, why we shift gears, and how to use shifting controls. In this lesson, you'll learn when to shift, including the step-by-step procedures and timing for upshifting and downshifting. You'll also learn about common shifting errors. Finally, you'll practice your shifting skills by driving through a series of simulated intersections. When you finish this lesson, you'll be fully prepared to move on to the gear recovery and fuel conservation lesson. The tachometer measures speed of the shaft that is coming out of the engine into the transmission, known as the transmission input shaft. It measures in revolutions per minute, or RPM. You'll notice the text on the gauge says RPM times 100. This means that when the gauge registers 5, the transmission input shaft is rotating 500 times per minute. 10 would be 1,000 revolutions per minute. 15 is 1,500 RPM, and so on. You'll notice that this tachometer doesn't start at 0. While some gauges do go that low, it's really not necessary, because most truck engines idle at 500 RPM or higher. If your RPMs are dropping below idle, your engine is seriously lugging and it's likely to quit. On the high side of the gauge, you'll see the red markings from 2,300 to 3,000 RPM. Most engine computers are set to automatically cut off fuel before engine speed goes very far into this high RPM range. When engine speed gets this high, it puts a lot of wear on the engine, and fuel economy also suffers. If RPM gets extremely high, it can cause engine damage. The green markings between 900 and 1,700 RPM on this gauge represent a kind of sweet spot where the engine runs most efficiently. For most driving situations, you want to use the gear that will keep your engine speed in this range. This gives you more control over your vehicle, and it helps you get better fuel mileage. Now, not all tachometers are marked the same way, and different engines will have different sweet spots. But this is a good one to start with. You'll learn about other engines as you get more experience. Downshifting can take a little more time to get used to, and its rhythm tends to vary more between drivers. This is because in a downshift, the driver is required to accelerate before the downshift is completed, and different drivers tend to take different amounts of time for this step. And sometimes it makes sense to allow more time for the road speed to drop too, depending on the road conditions. To give you a feel for downshifting, we'll describe what the steps are in an example of a driver downshifting from 5th gear to 4th gear. The driver initially is in 5th gear at 1,500 RPMs, going 14 miles per hour. The driver then begins by dropping their speed by pressing on the brake pedal and letting the engine speed fall to 1,000 RPM. Road speed falls to 11 miles per hour. Then the driver clutches to neutral. Next, the driver accelerates to get the engine speed back up to 1,500 RPM, at which point they move the shift lever against the gate for the next gear. That means moving the shift lever almost to the next gear position, as close as you can without actually shifting. Then the driver clutches to seat. The shift lever should slide into place as the gear engages. You should then release the clutch. Sometimes you missed the window, meaning that you didn't shift in time, or while the engine speed was still within a range for your target gear. If you missed the downshift the first time you raise RPMs, just rev the engine again. Hold the shift lever up against the gate for the target gear, and when the RPMs drop to match, it will slip right into gear. Some new drivers worry and stress about missing the timing on a shift. The way to overcome that is through practice, like you'll be doing later in this lesson, and in learning more about gear recovery techniques. We've talked about how RPMs drop off and then increase again when you shift. This change in RPMs between gears is called the gear step. Gear step varies from vehicle to vehicle and also depends on when a driver shifts within the allowable range between gears, but it's generally 300 to 600 RPMs. In this truck, it's about 500 RPM, which matches what we've already observed. Given that the gear step is 500 RPM, if you're upshifting and you shift out of gear at 1,500 RPM, you know you'll need to shift into the next gear at 1,000 RPM, one gear step lower. Think of shifting gears like going up and down a stairway in 500 RPM steps. To keep things simple, we'll be using 1,000 and 1,500 as shift points for all the gears during our practice. However, it's possible to shift in or out of a gear at a higher or lower RPM as long as the RPM difference between where you come out of gear and where you go into the next gear is 500 RPM. Don't get too worried about all the numbers. We'll guide you through the practice until you get the hang of it. And there's some margin for error on either side. As you practice shifting, you'll get familiar with the sound of the engine and the feel of the transmission. Then you won't need to focus so much on the numbers.